Hello and welcome to POLI239 British Party Politics Lecture 1, Political Parties and Party Systems. My name's Dr. David Jeffrey. My email is on the screen now and you can email me at any time during this module if you have any issues or any questions or anything you want clarifying. So political parties exist in every democracy. If someone offered you £1,000, however, to define a political party, you might struggle. For something so familiar to our day-to-day lives, our liberty and the operation of our political system, the political party is a fuzzy and confusing concept. But this is a module on party politics, so we have to grasp the nettle at some point and actually define political parties, what they do and what benefits they can provide to citizens and the system at large. And there's no time like the present. So we've got a lot of ground to cover in this lecture and it will almost certainly go on for more than an hour. So feel free to take a break or two as and when you need to. One of the advantages of this type of content delivery is flexibility, so you may as well use it. In this video, we'll explore what a political party is, political parties' core goals, and we'll also see how these goals come into conflict with one another and the trade-offs parties have to make in order to obtain some objectives and not others. Finally, we will look at party systems, methods of classifying them, and how we can measure these systems too. According to Pettit, political parties are the most important organisations in modern democratic states. And he's got a point. It's hard to imagine a democratic system operating without political parties in some form or another. Even non-democratic regimes such as Soviet Russia, modern-day China and North Korea use political parties to structure their political system and to also grant some element of external legitimacy. Despite their importance in democratic political systems, political party is a contested concept. There's no single shared definition which academics can agree on. And this is partly because of the variety of political parties in the real world. So some parties have clear hierarchies and they're well established, for example, the British Labour and Conservative parties. Others are equally well established but have less clear hierarchies and a looser organisation, so for example the US Republican and Democratic Party. Some are electoral vehicles simply built around a certain individual, such as Berlusconi's Forza Italia. Other political parties are decentralised and don't have typical leadership structures, such as the Icelandic Pirate Party. Some parties have a very narrow policy interest, such as Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, and some parties stand in elections with simply no hope of winning. The BNP, or the Women's Equality Party, or the Libertarian Party in the US presidential elections. Finally, other political parties are simply jokes, so the UK's Monster Raving Loony Party, or the Polish Beer Lovers Party, although in 1991 they did then win 16 seats. A political party is a little bit like your ideal partner. They're hard to describe, but we typically know it when we see it. For political scientists, that's not very useful, and that's not because we're typically an unattractive bunch, but because we need working definitions in order to compare cases, to know what we should include in our analyses and what we shouldn't include. And we'll talk about some of those different definitions in the next slide. So, what is a political party? Some theorists emphasise the importance of a common ideology. For example, Edmund Burke defined a party as a body of men united for promoting by their joint endeavours the national interest upon some particular principle in which they are all agreed. However, many organisations come together to promote joint endeavours in what they perceive to be the national interest based on a particular principle. So, for example, pressure groups and trade unions come together based around a common idea and in a way to promote a shared goal, but we don't consider them political parties. In fact, when British trade unions saw their legal position under threat at the end of the 19th century, they banded together, or some banded together, to form what became known as the Labour Party. So even amongst trade unions, for example, there's a recognition that a separate organisation is necessary for the political side of lobbying, or at least the representative side of lobbying. So we need to add an electoral element to our definition. Downes did just that. His definition of a political party goes, a coalition of men seeking to control a governing apparatus by legal means. And by legal means, we mean either duly contested elections or legitimate influence. However, again, the inclusion of all legitimate influence does not exclude trade unions or pressure groups because they still seek to control a governing apparatus either by providing candidates to a political party, so you can think of trade unions providing candidates to the Labour Party, or influencing politicians within the governing apparatus through things like lobbying, or in illegal cases, bribing. So it seems intuitive then that in addition to including a group of individuals who share a common outlook, we need to include an electoral arrangement. A good example of a definition which includes all three elements is Epstein's, and not that one. Epstein's definition is: what is meant by a political party is any group, however loosely organised, seeking to elect government office holders under a given label. However, there's a pretty large issue here as well, the inclusion of seeking to elect government office holders. And it's not always the case that every political party wishes to occupy office or even to actually win. So, for example, in the UK, Sinn Féin, for example, stand candidates in British general elections, and they win in half nearly of Northern Ireland's seats, but they refuse to take those seats, let alone enter government. But we'd still consider them a political party. Many more parties refuse to enter government coalitions with other parties. So, for example, the SNP in the UK would not enter into a coalition with the Conservative Party. And so electing government office holders can't be those organisations' primary goal. And so the importance of government office holding shouldn't be a core part of our definition. But parties do contest elections with the aims of winning seats in a legislature or fill an executive position, be it a council, national parliament. So it is a goal, but it's not forefront and core to a party's identity. And this leads us nicely to Pettit's definition, which states a political party is a group of people who, under a common label, fields candidates to popularly elected assemblies. And that's quite nice because it has no prior assumptions of whether those parties are likely to win, whether they will enter office or they'll abstain, things like that. It doesn't even say anything about their common ideology, just a common label. And that's simple, but it's effective. Other scholars emphasise other elements of political parties which go beyond Pettit's minimal definition, where argues that political parties aggregate interests, so they don't focus on a single issue. They combine positions on a range of issues, which encourages voters to compromise. Chambers argues the parties are relatively durable. They generate in-group perspectives, or at least symbols of identification or loyalty, but it's not apparent that these are essential to the concept of a political party. It might just be that they are optimal. Others emphasise the importance of continuity of organisation beyond the party's present leader, but it's not necessarily clear that an organisation centred on one individual is analytically, anyway, very different from a party which gets through a number of leaders. For example, UKIP, since Nigel Farage left, has got through, they're probably close to double figures now in terms of the amount of leaders they've had. They're still a political party, even though their organisation essentially crumbled when Farage left. So the political party, although it is an essentially contested concept, and that means scholars can reasonably disagree about how to define it, there is no single right definition. And often the definition chosen might depend on the cases or the areas or the timeframes or the specific element of a political party you yourself are interested in. We'll use Pettit's definition for the basis of this module, but you should, in your essays, always include a definition of political party, and Pettit's is completely fine to use. So now we've got a definition, we can look at organisations and say this is a party, this is not a party, which is pretty cool, but it's not the end of the story. So this definition of Pettit presents the political party as a unitary actor, rather than more accurately disaggregating the party down into a number of subunits, each of which have competing motivations and goals. So Key in the 1940s first articulated this, arguing that the term political party is applied without discrimination to many types of groups, which was bad, he thought. And he broke them down into three different subgroups, now known as the three phases of party organisation. These phases are the party in public office. This is the party, element of the party that operates in parliament or government. You might think of them as elected representatives. The party on the ground, the members, activists, volunteers, and so on, and the party in central office, which is the bureaucracy, like CCHQ or Labour HQ. And throughout this, we're probably going to talk in languages of the national parliament, right? The national legislature, national government. But this can equally apply to, local councils or supranational organisations like the EU. These three different faces have competing aims, goals and values. So, for example, the party on the ground would like to see certain policies enacted. That's why members campaign for one party over another. And we know that members of political parties tend to be more ideologically extreme than their elected representatives or the British public at large, or any public at large. And this phenomenon is known as May's law of curvilinear disparity. And we'll be covering that in a later lecture. And so huge elements of the party on the ground are seen to put pressure on elected representatives to enact policies which may be seen as extreme by the general public. And this pressure for certain policies may be seen in a way, it may be seen negatively and then lose the party votes at the next election. On the other hand, the party in public office comprises of politicians whose livelihood is based on being in office and who want to win elections in order to remain in that office. Thus, they aim to maximise their votes. Pursuing policies which are seen as too extreme is harmful to a vote maximising strategy, and thus the aims of the party in public office might run contrary to the aims of the party on the ground. And this is a source of conflict. We can think here of Tony Blair removing or pushing to remove Clause 4 from the Labour Constitution, and that committed the party to the nationalisation of industry. Now, that was popular amongst the members, but Tony Blair or the party in public office wanted to get into government, and so by removing that was a signal to the voters that the party was more moderate than it was in the past. Again, another example might be the Conservatives, where members pushed for a long time for a referendum on EU membership, and the Conservative party in office rejected that because they thought it would be a vote loser. However, if the party in public office ignores their traditional supporters too much, they might find themselves losing volunteers or members, and that means that they can't run campaigns as effectively as they might otherwise want to. Finally, the party in central office is often seen as subordinate to the party in public office. It's very rare for a party bureaucracy to dictate to elected representatives what to do, but it's not unheard of. For example, the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn saw Corbyn's office override the advice of Labour HQ when it came to electioneering, because Corbyn and his team wanted to follow their instincts, whilst the central office pointed to polling evidence which Team Corbyn ignored. There's also other elements where the party bureaucracy might want to protect the reputation of the party, which can lead to cover-ups and which can also be damaging for anybody wishing to win a vote maximising strategy. The party in central office also has a disciplinary role over members, often with the ability to expel them from the party if necessary, although it's seen as a last resort. This definition, though, of the three faces of party organisation, it allows us to use the concept of party in a more analytically useful way than just looking at the national legislature. So, for example, in the UK context, we can talk about Sinn Féin as a party in the electorate and as a party as organisation, even when we can't really talk about them as a party in office from a Westminster perspective, at least. And so we've seen that parties are not homogeneous blobs, but they're rather made up of subunits, which do not necessarily exist in harmony. Although, in theory, all aspects of the party want to win elections, the approach taken to this, and also the level of compromise willing to be made, or the prioritisation, varies. So we've said the parties want to win elections, but that's not all. So on the face of it, the question of what parties want might seem simple. According to our definition, they want to win elections. But often winning elections is just a means to an end. Muller and Strom argue that political parties just want three things. They want to get into office, so that's office-seeking behaviour. They want to enact policy-seeking behaviour. Or they want to win votes, vote-seeking behaviour. So together these form the basis of a conceptual framework for party political behaviour, which is important because frameworks allow for analysis, comparison and evaluation. So starting with the office-seeking party. Office-seeking parties want to maximise their control over the benefits of holding political office, that is, controlling as many government offices as possible, so by forming single-party government or by joining or increasing their size within a coalition government. It's important to remember that a lot of these theories were developed from a pan-European perspective rather than just a narrowly British perspective. So there's more of a focus on parties in coalition that we might not get if we just develop theory solely for Britain. The motivation for obtaining office isn't always clear, so it can be valued either from an intrinsic perspective, like the desire to win, or the value just achieved from victory, or an instrumental perspective, so it's easier to enact policy or to change society from a political office than it is as an outsider. There might also be a financial benefit to being an insider. Well, there'll be a salary, but there could be others, such as bribes, or there's political benefits of office, for example, immunity from prosecution, which in some countries is actually quite useful for some politicians. So whilst political scientists might have quite the ego, we don't typically think we're mind readers. So instead of trying to guess what drives a politician's behaviour, Muller and Strum argue it is enough to ask, is this behaviour aimed at increasing the party's control of executive office benefits for whatever reason, even if it means sacrificing policy objectives that are to our prospects in the next election? That's Muller and Strum, 1999, page 6, if you want to read that reference rather than listen to me garble it. If the answer to that question is yes, the behaviour is office seeking. In terms of the three faces of party organisation, the party in public office would be the most concerned with winning office because it's their livelihood. The party on the ground would also want to win office, but there's a lower threshold for compromise when it comes to watering down or removing policies to do so. The policy-seeking party, they aim to maximise their impact on public policy. So success in this realm is measured by a party's ability to change the public policy towards its most preferred position or to prevent undesirable changes, although that's not always possible. Firstly, parties have to compromise on their policy goals in order to achieve office, especially in coalition negotiations. For example, the Liberal Democrats abandoning their pledge not to increase tuition fees, or giving up on their dreams of PR in order to go into a coalition with the Conservatives in 2010. Secondly, events may force political parties to enact policies they do not want to do. 2008, when the Labour government was forced to reduce spending because of the financial crisis, the Greek political party Syriza having to bring in austerity policies despite being a left-wing socialist party. As with office-seeking motivations, policy motivations can be valued intrinsically because they're seen as the right thing to do, or instrumentally in that the party might benefit. So, you might want to reduce taxes because you think it's the right thing to do, or because you think you'll see a boost in your voter turnout come the next election. Typically, the party on the ground are especially concerned with policy seeking, given that they themselves don't directly benefit from holding office, apart from a vague feeling of satisfaction knowing their party won. And the party in public office may feel it's okay to jettison some policies if it boosts the likelihood of winning an election or staying in power. Finally, the vote-seeking party. The vote-seeking perspective was articulated by Downes, who argued that parties seek to maximise their vote share in order to maximise their strength in coalition negotiations or to enter office as a single party. Downes argued that once in office, the incentives are such that parties seek to formulate policies in order to win elections rather than win elections in order to formulate policies. This approach doesn't quite work with the logic of first past the post elections. So, for example, in Liverpool, there is really no need for the Labour Party to run a vote maximisation strategy or a turnout maximisation strategy because they're going to win the election anyway, right? There's, in a first past the post constituency election, 50.1% of the vote is going to win you a seat just as much as 100% of the vote will do. Whereas in PR systems, your share of the vote nationally is much more important. So vote maximisation only really makes sense in a PR system, not a first past the post system. So later scholars, building on Downes's work and his theories, rode back from the vote maximisation strategy. They argued the parties actually want to achieve enough votes to win, rather than arbitrarily aiming for maximum. But unlike office and policy goals, the desire for votes is only ever instrumental. Winning votes allows parties to achieve office and enact policies, but parties don't go into election only to win votes. In some countries where public funding for parties is based on vote shares, the party central office would be especially incentivized to maximize vote share in order to increase its own financial resources as well. So that's something else that might influence whether to follow a vote maximization strategy. So Muller and Strom note the party leaders rarely have the opportunity to realize all their goals simultaneously. They have to compromise, they have to engage in trade-offs. So seeking office, for example, can harm both vote-seeking and policy-seeking goals. Coalition parties usually have to forego some of their policies, as we've mentioned, and entering office can also cost a party votes. There's a wide body of literature which shows that junior coalition parties are often hard hit by coalition participation. Again, it's like there's such easy examples. The Lib Dems after the 2010 to 15 coalition with the Conservatives, or the liberal German FDP party, or FDP, who saw their support drop after going into coalition with Angela Merkel's CDU, CSU. Policies can conflict with winning votes and office as well. So, for example, the Liberal Democrat, I keep coming back to the Lib Dems, somebody should. The Lib Dems policy of revoking Article 50 and stopping Brexit alienated a lot of milder Remainers because it was seen as anti-democratic, but only fired up a smaller proportion of their base. Finally, political actors do not act in a vacuum. They are not free to solely pursue their own goals. They face environmental, contextual, institutional, and interpersonal restrictions on their behaviour. So there are legal or constitutional limits on the policies that can be proposed. So, no modern democracy is going to or can even propose arbitrary land grabs. It'd be very hard for any party to reintroduce the death penalty, for example. Vote maximisation cannot be pursued through every single mean imaginable. So you can't bribe people, you can't threaten people, things like that. And political office, office-seeking goals can't be met through bribery as well. So there are limits, and it's sometimes worth remembering that because different countries have different limits, different restrictions, and that plays into how fitting comparisons or case selection might be. All right, so that's the end of the section on the goals of political parties. We've provided a definition of political parties to aid with case selection and comparison. We've broken down the assumption that parties are unitary actors and examined different phases of party organisation. And we've also discussed the different goals parties may have and how there is often a tension between them. Take a break now. And before you carry on with the next part of the lecture, see if you can think of examples of when a party or parties have sacrificed one goal for another. All right, in this section, we'll look at the roles parties play in a liberal democracy. So we've covered what parties want and how they might achieve these goals. But political parties also contribute to the success or not of democratic regimes. As Katz notes, parties failing to perform these functions effectively may be the reason for regime collapse, which sounds, quite extreme. It's hard to think, because the Conservatives have messed up, the British state's going to collapse. But if we take a global view, political parties play a vital role in establishing and building support for new liberal democratic regimes. This also has a classificatory role in that we can use the specifications of what a party provides to liberal democracy as a way of ranking or evaluating real world political parties. So are they doing what they should be doing? How well are they doing it? And how do they go about doing it? And so you can provide a framework based on that. So it's useful to group the functions of parties into clusters. We have 4 we can use from CATS: coordination and mobilisation, recruitment, electioneering and representation. Coordination and mobilisation. Political parties have numerous coordination functions. They're expected to coordinate behaviour within government or within opposition and within the legislature more broadly. Majorities, however, do not guarantee stability. Party whips help to make sure MPs vote the right way and make sure there's a punishment for those who don't. This is linked to the idea of political programme formulation, in that one of the key purposes of political parties is to create, present, and if they get the chance, carry out a programme of political action. That's not possible if the party is not coordinated at the legislative or the government level. And so CAT argues that to the extent the parties perform a coordination function comprehensively and effectively, it becomes reasonable to regard parties as organisations rather than individual politicians who hold office in their name as central political actors. So essentially, if parties provide the coordination function they're supposed to, we can think of them as single units. If they don't, it makes a lot less sense to think of them as single units because they'll always be split. Political parties also coordinate the activity of like-minded citizens. They make it easy for individuals to know how to get involved in a political process. They can simply turn up at their local party branch and they can get involved. This links to the concept of the party on the ground as well. So parties in the electorate also have a mobilisation role. Parties also coordinate and structure the relationship between supporters and members and their elected representatives. So through conferences, forums, party motions. This is typically done through the party central office and links the party in public office and the party on the ground. In terms of recruitment, parties have a key role in selecting and recruiting candidates for elections and then for appointed officers. So cabinet ministers, prime ministers, council leaders, all of these, it's very rare for a political party to choose a non-party figure to be any of these positions. Typically, individuals have to work their way up the party organisation in order to reach the top jobs, and so parties act, in theory, as a gatekeeper for political leadership. In theory, individuals have to show competence within their party and talent to rise up, in theory. Similarly, candidates often have to fight unwinnable seats in order to progress to better seats or more winnable constituencies, thus providing candidates with training and socialising within party rules and norms. And parties also recruit citizens as members or activists and show these members what being active in politics is all about. That is, they socialise them into the role of political activists, which may lead to positions of responsibility in the organisation. And that was a quote from Pettit, 2014, page 15. Parties also play a role in electioneering. They help with the conduction of elections through providing candidates for whom the public can vote or not, as well as providing training for those candidates. They provide party labels to candidates, which helps both the candidate distinguish themselves amongst their rivals, but it also helps the public in providing a shortcut in understanding what the individual candidate actually stands for or believes in. In a world of independent candidates, you would have to explain to each voter your values and your policy positions, or the voter would have to look up the policy position of each candidate. But a party label instead provides a shorthand, and this helps to simplify choice to voters. The label is also often a quality guarantee. So parties have selection processes for candidates, and thus a party label is a statement to the voter that this candidate is competent and is able to fulfil the role that they're standing for and will vote broadly in line with the ideological position that you expect from that party. The party is also often a key framework within which policy is developed. So it's not, for example, It's not developed by gathering all parliamentary candidates in a room or writing a manifesto. Policies are not typically developed by one individual going out to listen to a wide range of people and then coming back and slapping something on the desk. It's typically developed within party frameworks itself, party research centres, things like that. The party also helps to raise and legally spend election funds and provides a professional organisation to help conduct elections. So agents, for example, which ensure the candidates are complying with the law. And the party also aims to educate citizens, usually in election campaigns, but also outside of this period. Parties need to set out their policies and the reasons behind them through campaigning, leaflets, debates, etc. And they typically communicate this through the mass media. Now they can use targeted ads on Facebook, but the point is still the same. In theory, it is to educate voters about the policy options available, usually with a healthy dose of spin. Finally, the representation role is important. Parties are the organisational embodiment in the political sphere of demographically or ideologically defined categories of citizens. Or to put it in layman's terms, Labour is an organisation for left-wing people, the Conservative Party is an organisation for right-wing people, the Liberal Democrats are an organisation for people who don't like to win elections, and so on. Interest articulation is also a key representative function. All parties aim to represent the interests of various groups in society, either based on ideology or demographics or region. Some aim to represent a narrow range of people, so for example the Scottish National Party, like most nationalist parties, whilst others aim to represent many groups. You can think of, for example, Labour and the Conservatives. Interest aggregation is also practiced by many parties. So this is the idea that political parties do not just focus on one issue, but a multitude of issues and package them all together into a manifesto with broader appeal. And this can happen on two levels, internally and externally. So parties aggregate interests internally when they build their manifesto for elections. So they will have to compete, they will have to balance the interests of different sides of the party. For example, Labour will have to balance the kind of the left wing, the Corbynite left wing, with the more moderate Social Democrats and the Blairites. The Conservatives will have to balance between One Nation Conservatives and kind of more Thatcherite Conservatives or blue-collar Conservatives. Whereas in the case of, say, UKIP, policy aggregation didn't really matter because everybody was there for one issue, and that was leaving the EU. Same with the SNP. There's very few people in the SNP who don't want Scotland to be independent. So you don't need to aggregate a range of interests on independence. Interest aggregation externally happens when parties enter coalition negotiations, but in both cases compromises have to be made, and that's important. It's seen as important to the social fabric of society because a society relies on individuals being able to compromise for it to flourish or do well. So coordination, recruitment, electioneering and representation are key functions the parties provide in liberal democracies. Pettit argues that perhaps the most important role of political parties is that they create linkage between governments and voters. Drawing on the works of Lawson, he outlines 4 different types of linkages: participatory, electoral, clientelistic and directive. Not all of these are good for democracy. The participatory linkage sees the party as a vehicle for encouraging citizen participation in the political sphere, beyond just voting in general elections. Lawson argues the participatory linkage is always good for democracy. The electoral linkage sees the party providing a way for people to get involved during election time, such as through campaigning, as well as interpreting members' views. This linkage may or may not contribute to democracy, depending on how accurately the party responds, how accurately it translates members' views into actual policy, and also what the members' views are. So an electoral linkage provided by a party with members that want to, overthrow democracy is by definition not going to be good for democracy. The clientelistic linkage sees the party rewarding areas for voting for the party, for example, through increased investment in that area. I mean, this linkage can help a party maintain power, but it can also be used to undermine free and fair competition. So it can either be good or bad for democracy. And we can see this less so in places where there are kind of strict rules or guidelines for how funding should be allocated. But in areas where it's not, you can easily see how, these type of practices would be negative. And finally, the directive linkage sees the party as a means of educating or coercing citizens. So obviously, coercion is bad for democracy, but political education within a party can be good for developing ideological debates, new policy, and a kind of freshness within the political system. Obviously, the extent to which each party fulfills these linkages varies between parties and between countries, as well as between political systems. For example, the Chinese Communist Party would provide a directive linkage to a much greater extent than parties within a democracy, whilst left-wing or socialist parties tend to prioritise the participatory linkage to a much greater extent than conservative parties. But again, this would only be prioritised within the party's group of voters. So as a typology or analytical framework, this allows for comparison and evaluation between cases, as well as a way of analysing a single case. And so the question on everyone's lips, so what? Well, at their core, parties are good for democracy because they allow people to come together and express their views. Parties are, in a democracy, essentially vehicles for convincing people to vote for you based on support for your agreed policies. They're inherently electoral in nature, and their electoral role help the process of representative democracy. They provide clear winners, e.g. Party X won 69 seats, and so help with identifying majority governments or viable coalition partners, which would be so much harder if everybody was an independent candidate. They also help by providing candidates with a clear policy platform upon which those individuals can be judged. Parties also play an integrative role, which is positive for democracy. They integrate citizens into democracy by educating them, providing identities, and encouraging or enabling participation through voting, being a candidate or an activist. They provide a forum where people can debate, discuss, compromise, but also by providing an identity, they can also provide buy-in to the political system. And we see this in the UK with the concept of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. This idea that even if a party loses and it doesn't go into government, they still respect the system as a whole. And that's important, because if parties lose and they don't respect the system, that threatens the stability of a democratic constitutional system. In a given political system, parties have to coexist with one another, and Duverger argued that the forms and modes of their coexistence define the party system of a particular country. Sartori developed this further. He argued that parties make for a system only when they're apart, in the plural, and a party system is precisely the system of interactions resulting from inter-party competition. And so, this means that party systems can only occur within a multi-party framework. One-party states such as Soviet Russia, North Korea, Manchester City Council between 2014 and 2016 could not be described as having a party system. In authoritarian regimes with more than one party, so for example Venezuela, we can talk about a party system, but generally speaking, academic work on this area focuses on democracies within generally competitive, free and fair elections. So that rules out Tower Hamlets. A party system then is relational, and it arises from parties' competition for elective office and interaction in between elections in both the formation and support of governments and the legislative process. That's from Wollenitz 2006, page 52. Finally, Sartori argued that a given arrangement of parties had to last beyond a single election to classify as a party system. There are a few key points to bear in mind about party systems. They're fluid, so they're not fixed. New parties can emerge, old parties can die. Parties within a party system do not just compete. They, to win office alone, they also cooperate, so they enter into coalitions. They non-aggression pacts, joint lists, or just maybe won't compete in the same areas as other parties. The ideological space in which parties operate is not fixed either. New issues or cleavages can emerge which then find political representation in new parties or provide a support base for previously fringe parties or completely new parties to mobilise on. Parts of the ideological spectrum which were previously off limits, so for example environmental concerns, populist positions, might lie dormant for a long time with no political competition on that space until they become politically salient. For example, the party system in Scotland used to be structured around the left-right class-based cleavage, but with the rise of independence as a salient political cleavage, turbo boosted by the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, the political space party system has been reconfigured to account for this new cleavage. So the party system is not something which exists in the abstract prior to parties, but rather party systems require parties to exist in order for the party system itself to have meaning. Counting political parties is, well, it's not as simple as just totting up the amount of parties who stood in the general election. For example, around 47 parties stood in the 2019 British general election, not including independents, but it doesn't make intuitive or analytical sense to say the UK is a 47-party system. Similarly, there are 10 parties represented in the House of Commons. Even calling the UK a 10-party system wouldn't be analytically useful. It's almost nonsensical because that doesn't actually tell you anything about the shape, the structure, or where the power lies within the party system itself. Instead, we want a measure which shows which parties matter. Although how you define matter is obviously a point of contention. So we'll look at two different ways. One is a qualitative judgment-based measure, and the second is a quantitative continuous measure. And they're both useful in their own analytical ways. And whichever one you use, or both if you want, it depends on the type of study that you're doing. So the first one is Sartori's measure. And he argued that we should look at which parties are relevant. So this would be measured by their coalition potential and their blackmail potential. And it's a discrete measure, so either parties matter or they don't. In this understanding, parties have coalition potential if they're necessary to support a government in office, i.e. do they have enough seats to make their inclusion in a coalition feasible or necessary? On the other hand, blackmail potential occurs when a party's existence or appearance affects the tactics of party competition. If it does neither of these, so if it doesn't have coalition potential or blackmail potential, then it is irrelevant. So let's have a look at the UK. For most of the period between 1945 and 2010, there have been no formal coalitions. Governments were either formed by the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, and so the UK's party system was two-party under this understanding. Only two parties were relevant. Even in 2005, when the Lib Dems won 62 seats, they would be seen as irrelevant under Sartori's definition because they were not needed to support any party in government, nor did they really change the pattern of party competition, which was focused on winning the median voter in the centre ground. However, in 2010, neither the Labour Party nor the Conservative Party had a majority of seats, and if either party wanted to form a government, they would have to ally themselves with the Liberal Democrats, who now had fewer seats at 57, but under Sartori's definition would now be relevant. So for Sartori and many people across the world, size does not matter. During the 2010 to 15 Parliament, UKIP could have also been considered as a relevant party, despite peaking with just 2 seats in the House of Commons, and they were only from defecting Conservatives. UKIP would have been relevant because of their blackmail potential. They affected the structure of party competition. They forced the Conservatives to compete on their ideological right and to go down a Eurosceptic path, as well as worrying Labour in some of Labour's traditional heartlands. For example, Ed Miliband and his infamous mug about controls on immigration was a clear response to the threat of UKIP. The second approach is by counting the effective number of political parties in a system. This approach provides for an adjusted number of political parties. The idea behind this measure is to count parties and at the same time weigh them based on each party's relative strength. Now you can do this in two ways. The first is to look at the votes cast, so that's within the electorate, or in the legislature based on the amount of seats won. And it's always the case that the effective number of political parties in the legislature is less than in the electorate, because in a general election, not every single candidate wins a seat and not every single vote leads to a person entering Parliament. So the formula for these is shown on the slide. And it does look a bit confusing, but it's okay because I've Googled it in advance. And all it means is that you take the proportion of each party's vote share or seat share, you square those values, you then add them all together, and then you divide 1 by that value. And this gives you the effective number of political parties. And we'll help with an example here. Okay, so here's an example. I've chosen New Zealand in 1993 and 1996. Why? Well, this is important because after 1993's general election, the country went from using a first-past-the-post majoritarian system to a mixed member proportional electoral system. So we can also see the difference the electoral system makes. So we have the vote share and the seat share shown in the table. The first thing we do is square each of these values, and that gives us the result in the long box or the rectangle. Then we add them all together, and you can see the result of that in the column, in the row with sum. And then we divide 1 by that number, and that gives us the effective number of parties. So we can see that in the 1993 general election, the effective number of parties in the electorate was 3.5. But as a result of the voting system, first past the post, it translated into just 2.1, 2.16, 2.2 parties in the legislature. And that's a reduction of 39%. And it creates a pretty solid two-party system. However, in 1996, with PR, the effective number of parties in the electorate was 4.32. And that was increased partially in the next election because people knew it wasn't a wasted opportunity anymore to vote for smaller parties, since under PR they had a much greater chance of getting in. So you had an effective number of parties in the electorate of 4.32, and in terms of effective number of parties in the legislature, this was reduced to 3.76, which is a reduction of just 13%, or 1/3 of the reduction seen in first past the post. So there are numerous ways that we can count relevant parties in a party system. Now we'll look at how we can classify party systems as a whole. So how can we classify party systems? Duverger's classification was pretty basic. He looked at whether a party system contained 2 parties or was multi-party. And obviously, analytically, that's not very useful. Blondel moved this analysis along somewhat by considering the relative size and strength of political parties. He created a typology which can be boiled down to 4 different outcomes: a 2-party system, such as the UK, from 1945 to 1970, where the 2 parties got over 80% of the vote; a 2.5-party system, where the 2-party vote share is lower, around 75%, but there are still 2 large parties, and typically 1 large small party, if that makes sense, instead of lots of smaller parties. Multi-system party with a predominant party, that's where 1 party gets about 40% and typically twice as much as the next party. A good example being the devolved Scottish and Welsh party systems or the recent French general election, or multi-party systems without a predominant party. Denmark, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, all good examples of this. Now, the percentages Blondel used came from case studies he was looking at in the 1940s to 60s, so the numbers themselves aren't particularly important, rather it's about the relative position, size and strength of those parties. But this classification hides the dynamics of party competition. So, for example, both Switzerland and Finland would be classed as multi-party systems without a predominant party, but that completely ignores the different political cultures and patterns of competition within the 2 countries. So Swiss political culture is more cooperative and open to power sharing than the polarised Finnish system. And it also doesn't note whether competition is towards the centre or if the pattern of party competition is going out to the extremes, and we'll cover that now. So Sartori's offering, because he just pops up everywhere, his offering was to combine the number of parties with the degree of polarization within the system. So based on whether the competition is centripetal, i.e. parties are encouraged to move towards the center to compete, or centrifugal, parties are encouraged to move to the extremes to compete. So Sartori ended with 4 types of party systems for democracies. A predominant party system, where one party regularly wins 50% of the seats in Parliament and predominates over a number of smaller parties, India and Japan being historic examples. A two-party system where the parties alternate in office, the US being a prime example of this, the UK as well, until recently. Moderate pluralism, where there are multiple parties, but they tend to compete in a bipolar manner, typically in a left-wing bloc and a right-wing bloc, but they're competing for the centre vote. And a good example of this is Denmark, where there are multiple parties, but they compete in these left-wing, right-wing blocs, and they alternate in office. So far, all the democratic systems assume parties are pro-system. So the parties fill different ideological spaces, but they do not question the legitimacy of the political system. Parties wish to win power within that system, rather than change it completely. Now that's not the case for the final system, polarised pluralism. And that's where there are multiple parties, but unlike in moderate pluralism, anti-system parties at the extreme compete for votes. So I've put this moderate versus polarised pluralism into some sort of graphical form, which hopefully will help with understanding. So in polarised pluralism, the structure of opposition is bilateral. Parties at the extreme oppose the centre parties, and they oppose each other as well. So parties in the centre have to compete with the extreme left and the extreme right, which pulls them away from the centre in terms of policies, but they also have to compete with other parties at the centre. So it's a much more complex electoral arrangement. For Sartori, the system is characterised by ideological divisions, centrifugal drives, irresponsible oppositions, i.e. oppositions that can offer policy but will never have to get into power to enact it, so they can basically outbid any sensible proposal from a kind of more centrist party. They can always go one step further, and that will constantly push, that will shift the Overton window and shift the range of what is acceptable. Because they don't have to be responsible, oppositions proposing alternatives, they just have to oppose whatever the government does. So some argue that the recent rise of populism in Europe has moved a number of party systems from moderate pluralism to polarised pluralism, as traditional parties seek to counter anti-system promises. But an example, quite worrying example of polarised pluralism was Weimar Germany in 1919 to 1933, as well as Italy from 1946 to 1992, where a strong centre party, Christian Democratic Party, was opposed on both sides by unreformed anti-system parties, the Italian Communist Party and the post-fascist Italian Social Movement. And that's from Caramani, 2008, page 332. So Sartori's work was important because it provided a way to separate cases of polarised pluralism, racked by centrifugal tendencies and cabinet instability, from moderate pluralism, in which the direction of competition was centripetal and stable, multi-party competition was the norm. That's from Wollenitz, 2006, page 52. It's also concerned with the patterns of competition and interaction between parties, and is though concerned explicitly with the party system itself, rather than just counting the number or the size of parties. So when it comes down to party systems, it's not just the number of parties that matter, it's not just their size, it's also how they interact with one another and the broader political system at large, and how they compete with one another. So there we are. We've achieved a lot in this lecture, I think. We know what political parties are, what they want, what they can contribute to liberal democracy. We also know what a party system is, the way parties interact with one another in the pursuit of power. We know a few ways to measure the number of relevant parties in a party system, and we've also looked at a couple of ways to classify party systems. There are, however, some debates that we've not covered here. So what actually determines the number of parties in a party system? So are social cleavages or voting systems more important? And that's pretty much what we'll be looking at the next few lectures. And what is better, 2 or more, in terms of the number of parties in the party system? It used to be The people argued a two-party system fostered stability, better government, and provided clearer accountability and choice at elections. But this has come under significant criticism, largely for being very American-centric. Can you imagine such a thing? Now, multi-party systems are seen as more stable and as giving a broader range of choices to voters, which improves satisfaction with democracy. On the next slide, you'll find a reading list. If there's anything you're interested in, obviously you don't have to read them all. Any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm going to shortly arrange some sort of office hour system. But for now, if you do have any questions, please do just drop me an email. Thank you.